in the gentle light of dawn, as the first tentative rays of sunlight pierce through the small, leaded glass windows of an Oxford hall. A young scholar stirs beneath his woolen blankets. The year is 1503, and Thomas Becket, son of a prosperous wool merchant from the south of England, begins another day at this ancient seat of learning. The stone walls of his chamber hold the chill of night, and his breath forms small clouds that hang in the air before dissipating into nothingness. His small room, merely 10 feet by 8 feet in dimension, contains the simple furnishings that define a scholar's existence. A narrow wooden bed with a straw-filled mattress covered by woolen blankets. A simple oak table that serves as both desk and dining table. A 3-legged stool, and a chest for his few possessions. Thomas reaches beneath his bed for his chamber pot, relieving himself with the quiet resignation of one accustomed to the morning ritual. The sounds of other students stirring in adjacent rooms filter through the thick stone walls, coughs, yawns, and the occasional muttered Latin phrase. His gaze drifts to the small shelf above his desk, where several precious books rest, their leather bindings showing the wear of frequent use. Among them, his prized copy of Aristotle's works, painstakingly copied during long hours in the college library, and a small prayer book given to him by his mother before his journey to Oxford. The college bell begins to toll, its deep resonance calling students to morning prayer. Thomas knows he must hurry. The master is strict about attendance at chapel, and latecomers face public admonishment or even small fines that would strain his carefully managed finances. He splashes water from a ceramic basin onto his face, the shock of cold helping to clear the fog of sleep from his mind. The water had been carried up to his room the previous evening by one of the college servants, a luxury provided to students that reminds them of their privileged position in society. Dressing quickly, Thomas pulls on his linen undergarments, woolen hose, and simple black gowns that marks him as a student of the university. The gown, though somewhat worn at the edges, is still respectable enough for daily wear. His fingers, stiff from the cold, struggle with the fastenings of his shoes, simple leather affairs with wooden soles that clatter on the stone floors of the college. As he finishes dressing, he reaches for his cap, another requirement of the university's dress code. Placing it carefully on his head, the corridor outside his room buzzes with the quiet activity of dozens of young men preparing for the day. Some are already making their way down the narrow, winding staircase toward the chapel, their footsteps echoing against the stone. Others call quietly to friends, arranging to walk together or discussing the lectures they would attend that day. Thomas joins the flow, nodding to familiar faces as he descends the worn steps, his hand trailing along the rough stone wall for balance. The quadrangle outside is damp with morning dew, and a light mist hangs in the air, softening the edges of the college buildings. The chapel stands opposite, its Gothic windows glowing with the light of candles already lit within. The sounds of the awakening city beyond the college walls filter in the distant calls of market traders setting up their stalls, the occasional bark of a dog, the clattering of a cart on cobblestones. But within the quadrangle, there is a sense of separation, of peaceful removal from the bustle of ordinary life. Thomas joins the stream of black-gowned figures flowing toward the chapel, all moving with the unhurried certainty of those following a well-established routine. Some students appear fresh-faced and alert, while others still battle the desire to return to their beds. A few whisper among themselves, but most maintain the respectful silence expected before worship. As he approaches the chapel door, Thomas can hear the soft notes of the organ within, preparing the space for prayer inside. The chapel glows with candlelight, the flames reflected in the polished wood of the pews and creating dancing shadows on the stone walls. The scent of beeswax and incense fills the air, familiar and comforting. Thomas finds his assigned place, kneeling briefly before taking his seat. Around him, other students do the same, a choreographed ritual performed daily without thought. The master and fellows of the college process, in their more elaborate gowns, marking their status and authority, taking their places at the front of the chapel as the service begins. Thomas allows his mind to drift slightly, the familiar Latin prayers washing over him like gentle waves. The college chaplain's voice rises and falls in familiar cadences, reciting prayers that have been spoken in this space for centuries. Thomas knows each word, each response, each moment when to stand or kneel. Outside, the day brightens, sending colorful beams of light through the stained glass windows, painting the chapel floor with blues, reds, and golds. When the service concludes, some 40 minutes later, Thomas joins the orderly procession out of the chapel, now fully awake and ready for the day ahead. His stomach rumbles with hunger. Breakfast awaits in the college hall, a simple meal, but one he looks forward to after the long night's fast. He follows his fellow students across the quadrangle toward the hall, their gowns fluttering gently in the morning breeze. The hall, with its high ceiling and long oak tables, hums with the subdued conversation of hungry scholars. Thomas takes his place on one of the benches, sitting beside students he has come to know during his time at Oxford. The serving staff, college servants in simple attire, move efficiently between the tables, carrying trays laden with bread, ale, and simple porridge. The students are expected to provide their own spoons and knives, and Thomas reaches into his sleeve to withdraw his own set, worn from years of use but polished to a soft glow. The bread is dark and hearty, baked in the college kitchens before dawn. Thomas tears off a piece, savoring the chewy texture and nutty flavor. The porridge is plain but filling, enhanced by a drizzle of honey for those fortunate enough to afford such luxuries. Thomas has budgeted carefully to allow for this small indulgence, knowing that the sweetness will help sustain him through the morning lectures. The ale, weak but refreshing, washes down the simple fare. Around him, conversation ebbs and flows. Students discuss the day's lectures, debate points of logic or theology, or simply share news from home. For those who have recently received letters, Thomas listens more than speaks, absorbing the rhythms of scholarly discourse that surround him. At the high table, elevated at the end of the hall, the college fellows dine on slightly more elaborate fare, their position of authority reflected in their dining arrangements. Breakfast concludes with a brief Latin grace, and students begin to disperse to their various lectures and studies. Thomas gathers his wooden trencher and spoon, carrying them to the designated collection point where servants will clean them for the next meal. He returns to his chamber briefly, collecting the books and notes he will need for his morning classes. His satchel, made of sturdy leather, gifted by his father, hangs heavily at his side as he exits the college gates. The streets of Oxford bustle with activity in the full light of morning. Traders call out their wares, apprentices hurry on errands, and the occasional cart rumbles past, splashing through puddles left by recent rain. Thomas navigates the familiar route toward the schools, the university buildings where lectures are held. Other students flow in the same direction, a river of black gowns moving purposefully through the town. The morning air has lost some of its chill as the sun climbs higher, and Thomas loosens his cloak slightly as he walks. The familiar landmarks of Oxford pass by the church towers rising above the town buildings, the market square now filled with colorful stalls, the imposing stone facades of other colleges. Despite the activity, there is an ordered quality to the chaos, a sense that each person knows their place and purpose in this community of learning. As Thomas approaches the schools, he mentally prepares for the lectures ahead. Today brings studies in logic and rhetoric, challenging subjects that require his full attention. He joins the crowd of students entering the building, climbing the worn stone stairs to the appropriate lecture room. Finding a seat on one of the hard wooden benches, he arranges his materials, ready to absorb the wisdom offered by the university masters. The lecture room gradually fills with students, their voices creating a low hum of anticipation. The windows, set high in the walls, allow light but offer no distractions from the outside world. The room smells of parchment, ink, and the wool of student gowns, a scholarly perfume familiar to all who study here. As the appointed hour approaches, the conversation dims, heads turning expectantly toward the door through which the master will enter. When the lecturer appears, a man of middle years, with a serious expression and the elaborate gown of his station, the room falls completely silent. Thomas, like his fellow students, prepares to absorb the words of wisdom about to be shared, his quill poised above a sheet of parchment, ready to capture the essential points of the lecture. Another day of learning at Oxford has truly begun, continuing a tradition of scholarship that has persisted for centuries and will continue for centuries more. The deep, resonant tone of the chapel bell marks the hours at Oxford, dividing the day into segments of study, prayer, and sustenance. For William Hartwell, a second-year scholar at Magdalen College, the bell has become more than a timekeeper, is the heartbeat of his academic existence. As the bell tolls 6 times on this crisp autumn morning in 1505, William stirs beneath his woolen blankets, reluctant to leave their warmth for the cold stone floor of his chamber. The bell's voice echoes across the quadrangle, bouncing off ancient walls and filtering through the small window of William's room. This is the first bell of the day, calling students to rise and prepare for morning prayers. William knows from experience that ignoring its summons brings consequences. The college statutes are clear about the mandatory nature of chapel attendance, and the college porters have been known to knock on doors of absent students, dragging them from warm beds to fulfill their religious obligations. With a sigh that forms a small cloud in the chilled air, William swings his feet to the floor, wincing at the cold that seeps through his woolen socks. His chamber, located on the 2nd floor of the college's north quadrangle, is Spartan but adequate. A narrow bed, a sturdy oak desk and chair, a small bookshelf, and a chest for his clothing and personal items. These constitute the entirety of his furnishings. The walls, built of solid Oxford stone, keep out the worst of the wind, but do little to retain heat. Once the small fireplace has burned down to embers overnight, William moves to the basin of water that sits on a small stand near his desk. The water, delivered by a college servant the previous evening, has developed a thin skin of ice overnight. Breaking through it with his fingers, William splashes the frigid water on his face, gasping at the shock but appreciating how effectively it banishes the last vestiges of sleep from his mind. He runs wet fingers through his hair, attempting to tame it into some semblance of respectability. Dressing is a quick affair, practiced through countless repetitions. First, the linen undergarments, then woolen leggings for warmth, followed by his everyday tunic of sturdy wool. Over this goes his academic gown, the uniform of all Oxford scholars, showing signs of wear but still presentable enough to avoid comment from the college authorities. A simple cap completes his attire, and he slips his feet into leather shoes that have molded to the shape of his feet through constant use. As William leaves his chamber, locking the door with a large iron key that he tucks into his belt pouch, he joins a stream of similarly attired young men moving with varying degrees of alertness toward the chapel. Some exchange quiet greetings or discuss the day ahead in hushed tones. Others walk in silence, still half asleep, or perhaps contemplating the spiritual devotions to come. The flagstones of the quadrangle are slick with morning dew, and William treads carefully, having seen fellow students take undignified tumbles on these same stones. The college chapel, a magnificent structure of stone and stained glass, glows with candlelight as William enters. The space, designed to inspire religious devotion through its soaring arches and carefully crafted beauty, never fails to affect him. No matter how routine the daily services become, the chapel itself commands respect and a certain humbling of the spirit. William finds his assigned place among the junior scholars. Kneeling briefly before sliding onto the wooden bench, the chapel fills quickly as the second bell tolls, warning that the service will begin momentarily. The college fellows, distinguished by their more elaborate gowns and advanced age, occupy the front rows. Behind them sit the scholars, according to rank and time at the college, with the newest members furthest from the altar. The chaplain, resplendent in ecclesiastical vestments, processes in with acolytes bearing candles and incense. Marking the formal beginning of morning prayers, the service proceeds in Latin, the universal language of scholarship and religion. William follows along without difficulty, the words familiar after years of repetition. Psalms are chanted, prayers intoned, and a brief homily delivered on the virtues of scholarly diligence. Throughout, William's mind occasionally wanders to the day ahead, lectures to attend, texts to study, a disputation to prepare for. He pulls his attention back to the service, conscious that inattentiveness might be noted by the watchful eyes of college officials. As the service concludes, some 45 minutes later, William joins the orderly procession from the chapel, moving with his fellow students toward the college hall for the morning meal. The hall, nearly as impressive as the chapel with its high ceiling and ornate hammer-beam roof, echoes with the scraping of benches and the low murmur of conversation as students take their places at long oak tables arranged in rows. William sits with friends from his year of study, greeting them with nods and quiet words as they settle onto benches worn smooth by generations of scholars. The tables are already set with wooden trenchers and cups, though students provide their own spoons and knives. College servants move efficiently between the tables, distributing bread and filling cups with small beer, the weak ale that constitutes the standard breakfast beverage. The menu is simple, but filling: dark bread, freshly baked in the college kitchens, a porridge of oats with a small amount of honey for those who can afford this luxury, and occasionally a portion of salt fish on days that are not designated for fasting. William eats with appreciation, knowing that nourishment now will sustain him through hours of lectures before the midday meal. Conversation at the table focuses on academic matters. Lectures anticipated that day, difficulties with assigned texts, approaching examinations. Occasionally, news from the world beyond Oxford intrudes: tales of the king's activities, rumors of diplomatic intrigues, or stories brought by students who have recently returned from visiting their families. William listens more than he speaks, absorbing information that might prove useful in his studies or in navigating the complex social world of the university. As the meal concludes, his fellows depositing his eating implements in the designated collection area, he returns briefly to his chamber to collect the materials needed for morning lectures: a small bound notebook for taking notes, several quills, and a stoppered inkpot, and the texts assigned for the day's discussions. The bell rings again as William crosses the main quadrangle, this time signaling the approach of the first lecture hour. Students from all colleges now stream through Oxford's narrow streets toward the schools, the university buildings, where most formal instruction takes place. William joins this scholarly procession, nodding to acquaintances from other colleges. As they converge on their destination, the lecture hall fills quickly. Students finding places on benches arranged in tiers facing the lecturer's raised platform. William secures a spot near the front, wanting to catch every word of the day's presentation on Aristotelian logic. The space smells of wool garments, parchment, and the distinctive scent of scholarly concentration, a mixture of ink, leather, bindings, and the slight mustiness of well-used books. As the university master enters, resplendent in his formal academic regalia, a hush falls over the assembled students. The lecture begins without preamble, the master's Latin flowing in precise, measured tones as he expounds on the complexities of syllogistic reasoning. William's quill scratches across his notebook, capturing key points and occasional verbatim passages that seem particularly insightful, or that he might want to reference in future disputations. For 2 hours, the lecture continues without interruption. The master's voice, the only sound apart from the occasional cough or the scratching of quills. The room grows stuffy with the combined breath and body heat of dozens of concentrated scholars, but William hardly notices, absorbed in the intellectual challenge of following complex philosophical arguments. When the hour concludes, marked by what else? The ringing of a bell from a nearby church tower, William gathers his materials and joins the exodus from the lecture hall. Some students remain to ask questions of the master. Others hurry to their next obligation, and some gather in small groups to discuss what they've just heard, extending the lecture through their own analysis and debate. William has a short break before his next lecture, and he uses this time to visit one of the university's libraries. Here, among towering shelves of chained books. He locates a volume referenced in the morning's lecture, seeking clarification on a point that had confused him. The library is hushed, with only the occasional whisper or rustle of turning pages, disturbing the scholarly silence. Light streams through high windows, illuminating ancient texts and the bent heads of students absorbed in their contents. The library bell chimes softly, warning that the noon hour approaches. William reluctantly closes his book, returning it to its place on the chain that secures it to the shelf. He gathers his belongings once more, joining the streams of black-gowned figures, now heading back toward their respective colleges for the midday meal as he walks. The bells of Oxford toll noon from dozens of towers across the city, a cacophonous symphony that nonetheless contains order and meaning. For those who have learned to distinguish the voice of their own college bell from the general chorus, William quickens his pace, knowing that the hall doors will close promptly at the final stroke, leaving latecomers to seek their meal elsewhere in the town at their own expense. The rhythm of bells continues throughout the day, marking periods of study, prayer, meals, and curfew. By the time the evening bell tolls, signaling the closing of college gates for the night, William has attended 3 lectures, participated in a group disputation, studied privately in the library, attended evening prayers, consumed 2 more meals in hall, and spent a precious hour in conversation with friends over a jug of ale in a fellow student's chamber as he prepares for bed. The final bell of the day rings out across Oxford curfew, 9 o'clock, when all students should be within their college walls. William listens to its deep, sonorous tones as he changes into his nightclothes, a long linen shirt that serves as his sleeping garment. The sound is comforting in its familiarity, a constant in a life dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge that can sometimes seem overwhelming in its demands. The bell falls silent, but its echo seems to linger in the darkness of William's chamber. Tomorrow it will ring again, summoning him to prayers, to meals, to lectures, to the ordered existence of an Oxford scholar. As sleep begins to claim him, William's last conscious thought is of gratitude for the bell-stern taskmaster, though it may be it provides structure to his scholarly life, dividing his days into manageable portions devoted to the pursuit of wisdom and the glory of God. Edward Northwood adjusts himself on the hard mattress of his narrow bed, trying to find a position that avoids both the lumps in the straw filling and the sagging center that has developed over years of use. His chamber in St. Mary's Hall is typical of student accommodations at Oxford in the year 1508, small, sparse, and distinctly lacking in comfort. Yet to Edward, son of a prosperous but not wealthy merchant from Bristol, these quarters represent opportunity, a chance to obtain the education that might elevate him to a position in the church or royal administration. The room measures approximately 10 feet by 8 feet, carved from the larger space of what was once a medieval townhouse donated to the university decades earlier. The stone walls, unadorned except for a small wooden crucifix, retain the chill of the autumn evening despite the small fire that Edward has been allowed to light in the modest hearth. Above, heavy oak beams support the ceiling, darkened by years of smoke from countless student fires. A single window provides illumination during daylight hours, its leaded panes set into a deep stone embrasure that creates a small alcove where Edward sometimes sits to read when the light is favorable. The glass is uneven and slightly greenish, distorting the view of the quadrangle below and the buildings beyond. But it keeps out the worst of the wind and rain that frequently sweep across Oxford from the surrounding countryside. Edward's furnishings are few but functional, allocated to him by the hall and supplemented by items he brought from home or acquired during his time at the university. The narrow bed occupies one wall, covered with linens he provides himself and washes infrequently, relying on the services of local laundresses only when absolutely necessary to conserve his limited funds. A rough woolen blanket provides warmth on all but the coldest nights, supplemented in winter by his cloak laid on top for additional insulation. Near the window stands a simple oak table that serves as both desk and dining surface, accompanied by a three-legged stool that wobbles slightly on the uneven flagstone floor. Edward has learned to compensate for this instability, adjusting his weight unconsciously as he sits for hours copying texts or composing responses to scholarly questions. A large wooden chest, secured with an iron lock to which only Edward has the key, contains his clothing, 2 sets of everyday garments, one better outfit for special occasions, and the academic gown required of all Oxford students. The chest also holds his most valuable possessions, several books purchased at great expense, a silver cup gifted by his father upon his departure for university, and a small pouch containing carefully counted coins that must sustain him until his next allowance arrives. A second, smaller chest holds Edward's scholarly materials, sheets of parchment and paper, carefully preserved quills, a precious ink pot with a tight-fitting lid, sealing wax, and various notes from lectures and personal studies. This chest remains unlocked during the day for convenience, but is secured at night or when Edward leaves the room for extended periods, protecting the tools of learning that represent a significant financial investment. The room's only decorative element, besides the simple crucifix, is a small tapestry sent by Edward's mother to bring some warmth to those cold walls. Depicting a hunting scene in somewhat faded colors, it hangs opposite the bed where Edward can see it upon waking, a reminder of home and family in this ascetic, academic environment. Lighting comes from tallow candles, their smoky flame casting moving shadows across the walls and ceiling. Edward uses them sparingly, aware of their cost and the difficulty of studying by their unsteady light. In winter months, when darkness falls by mid-afternoon, he often joins fellow students in communal areas where multiple candles or rushlights provide better illumination for reading or discussion. Heat is a perpetual challenge. The small fireplace provides minimal warmth, and fuel is strictly rationed by college authorities. Students are permitted to burn a specified amount of wood or coal each week, delivered by college servants and carefully monitored. Those who exhaust their allocation must either purchase additional fuel at personal expense or endure the cold. Many students, Edward included, developed the habit of studying in the college library or hall during winter months, taking advantage of the larger fires maintained in these communal spaces. Privacy is a luxury rarely experienced, though Edward has his own chamber, a privilege not granted to all students, some of whom share rooms or even beds. The walls are thin, and the sounds of neighboring scholars filter through readily. Conversations arguments, singing permitted at certain hours, coughing, and snoring create a constant auditory backdrop to academic life. College servants and officials may enter chambers with minimal notice to check for prohibited items, ensure compliance with regulations, or deliver messages. Sanitation is rudimentary at best. A chamber pot beneath the bed serves immediate needs and must be emptied by Edward himself each morning at designated locations in the college grounds. For more substantial ablutions, students use communal facilities located in the college's outer buildings, often unheated and uncomfortable. Bathing is infrequent, limited by both custom and practicality to occasional visits to public bathhouses in the town, or, for the more affluent, private arrangements with servants to bring heated water to their chambers. Water for drinking and washing comes from the college well, carried to upper floors by servants or by students themselves, depending on the customs of particular institutions. Each evening, a small jug of fresh water is delivered to Edward's room for morning washing, frequently developing a skin of ice during winter nights. Meals are taken communally in the hall, with only occasional informal eating in chambers when circumstances permit. College regulations often prohibit the keeping of food in rooms to discourage vermin, though many students maintain small hoards of bread, cheese, nuts, or dried fruit for late-night studying, or when illness prevents attendance at regular meals. Despite these Spartan conditions, Edward's room has become home, a personal space in an institution where most activities occur communally. He has learned to organize his limited possessions efficiently, to extract maximum comfort from minimal furnishings, and to create a routine that accommodates the physical limitations of his environment as he finally finds a tolerable position. On his lumpy mattress, Edward reflects that, compared to many of his contemporaries, he enjoys relative luxury. Some students in poorer halls or those of lower status share rooms with 2 or 3 others, sacrificing even the limited privacy he enjoys. Others serve as personal servants to wealthier students or college fellows in exchange for accommodation and education, living in conditions far more restricted than his own. The moonlight filtering through the leaded window casts patterns across the stone floor as Edward drifts toward sleep. Tomorrow will bring the same challenges: the cold morning, washing, the hard bench at lectures, the struggle to see his texts in insufficient light. Yet these discomforts are the price of education, the physical conditions that accompany the extraordinary privilege of studying at Oxford, and Edward accepts them as part of his scholarly journey in his final moments of wakefulness, as the sounds of the college settle into the quieter rhythms of night. Edward considers how these Spartan quarters have shaped him, teaching patience, endurance, and appreciation for simple comforts. These lessons, while not part of the formal curriculum, may prove as valuable in life as the knowledge gained from books and lectures in this ancient institution of learning. The great oak doors of the college hall swing open precisely at noon, admitting a flood of black-gowned students eager for their midday meal. Among them is Richard Cooper, a third-year student at New College, who takes his customary place at one of the long tables arranged perpendicular to the high table where the master and fellows dine. The hall, with its high ceiling, impressive hammer-beam roof, and walls adorned with portraits of distinguished college members, serves as the focal point of communal life. where students gather 3 times daily to break their fast, take their midday meal, and sup together in the evening. Richard settles onto the wooden bench, worn smooth by generations of scholars before him. The dining arrangements follow strict hierarchical principles: senior fellows nearest the high table, junior fellows next, then graduate students, scholars, and finally ordinary undergraduates arranged by year and standing. This physical manifestation of the university's hierarchy is observed without question. Each student knowing precisely where they belong in the academic community. The tables are already set with wooden trenchers flat, square pieces of stale bread that serve as both plate and, after use, food for the poor or college servants. Beside each place sits a wooden cup, and students produce their own knives and spoons from pouches at their belts or sleeves. Forks are rarely used, most food being eaten with fingers or spoons, with knives reserved for cutting meat on the infrequent occasions when it appears on the menu. College servants move efficiently between the tables, bringing pitchers of small beer, the weak, everyday ale that constitutes the standard beverage for all meals. Water is seldom drunk except by the most ascetic, being generally considered unhealthy and potentially dangerous due to contamination. The small beer, with its low alcohol content, provides safe hydration, while the brewing process kills harmful organisms that might lurk in untreated water. Grace is said in Latin, led by the senior fellow present, with all students standing respectfully until its conclusion. Only then does the meal properly begin, with servants bringing large communal bowls of pottage, thick soup of vegetables and grains that forms the foundation of most college meals. Richard dips his spoon into the shared bowl, transferring a portion to his trencher. The pottage today contains barley, onions, and turnips, seasoned simply with salt and a few herbs from the college garden. On fast days, which occur regularly throughout the academic year following the church calendar, the pottage contains no animal products. But today, being an ordinary day, small pieces of salt pork add flavor and substance to the mix. Following the pottage comes bread, dark, dense loaves made from maslin flour, a mixture of wheat and rye. Richard tears off a substantial piece, using it to soak up the remaining liquid from his pottage. Bread constitutes the single most important element of the Oxford student's diet, providing the bulk of daily calories and nutrition. College statutes often specify precisely how much bread each student is entitled to, commonly 2 pounds per day, divided among the 3 meals. Conversation flows around Richard as he eats, conducted primarily in Latin as required by college regulations during formal meals. Students discuss the morning's lectures, debate points of philosophy or theology, or exchange news from beyond the university walls. Speaking in English results in a small fine, a rule designed to reinforce the scholar's facility with Latin, the universal language of learning. Some colleges even employ special officers known as Lupus Wolf, who circulate during meals, listening for vernacular speech and noting offenders. For this ordinary weekday meal, the pottage and bread constitute the main offerings, supplemented occasionally by cheese, eggs, or seasonal vegetables. Richard accepts a portion of hard cheese when it reaches him, cutting a modest slice with his knife and adding it to his trencher. The cheese is sharp and slightly dry, made from the milk of cows that graze on college-owned pastures outside the city walls. Meals on feast days, celebrations of important saints, or significant college anniversaries are considerably more elaborate. On these special occasions, the tables might feature roasted meats, fish prepared in various ways, fowl, spiced sauces, and even sweet confections for dessert. Wine might replace ale for those of higher status, though students generally continue to receive the familiar small beer, regardless of the celebration, after the main courses. A servant passes with a basket of apples, harvested from the college orchard. Richard selects one, its skin slightly wrinkled from storage, but the flesh still crisp and tart. Fruit appears regularly at Oxford tables when in season or properly stored, providing welcome variety to the otherwise monotonous diet throughout the meal. Readers appointed from among the junior fellows or scholars recite from religious or classical texts in Latin, their voices rising above the muted sounds of eating and subdued conversation. This practice serves both educational and disciplinary purposes, discouraging excessive talking and providing intellectual nourishment alongside physical sustenance. Today's reading comes from the works of St. Augustine, his meditations on the proper Christian life flowing over the assembled diners. At the high table, the master and fellows enjoy slightly more refined versions of the same basic fare. Their bread is whiter, made from finer flour. Their pottage might contain more meat. They might receive individual portions rather than sharing communal bowls. Wine is served in addition to ale, though its consumption is moderated by college rules against excess. These small distinctions reinforce the hierarchical nature of college life while maintaining the communal experience of dining together. When the meal concludes, announced by a small bell and another Latin grace, students rise from their places, collecting their personal utensils. The wooden trenchers, now soaked with the remnants of the meal, are gathered by servants to be distributed to the poor who gather daily at the college gates. Nothing is wasted in this carefully regulated economy of food. Even scraps and leftovers find their way to college animals or to the most destitute of Oxford's population. Richard returns his cup to the designated collection point and tucks his spoon and knife back into his belt pouch. He exchanges a few words with fellow students as they exit the hall, discussing plans for afternoon studies or commenting on the reading that accompanied their meal. The entire dining experience has taken less than 45 minutes, efficiency being valued in this institution where time is carefully allocated between religious obligations and scholarly pursuits. The evening meal follows a similar pattern, though typically lighter than the midday repast, served between 5 and 6 o'clock, depending on the season. Supper might consist of bread, cheese, perhaps cold meats or fish previously cooked, and the ever-present small beer. After this final communal meal, students return to their chambers for private study or gather in small groups for discussion and scholarly exchange until the curfew bell signals the end of the day's activities. Special dietary arrangements exist. 4 fast days, which occur with remarkable frequency throughout the academic year. Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays are typically designated as fish days, when meat is forbidden. During Advent and Lent, restrictions become even more severe, with dairy products and eggs also prohibited on certain days. The college kitchens adapt to these requirements, preparing fish in various forms, legume dishes, and vegetable-based meals that comply with religious obligations, while still providing adequate nutrition for students with additional financial resources. The college diet can be supplemented through purchases from town markets or arrangements with college servants for extra food. Some colleges permit battles, a system whereby students can purchase additional items through the college and have the costs added to their quarterly bills. Richard occasionally uses this system to obtain extra ale or higher quality bread. When his allowance permits such luxuries, food and drink at Oxford serve purposes beyond mere sustenance. They reinforce community through shared consumption, establish and maintain hierarchical distinctions, provide structure to the daily schedule, and reflect the religious calendar that governs university life. For Richard and his fellow students, the simple fare of bread and ale represents not just physical nourishment, but participation in centuries-old traditions that bind them to generations of scholars who have dined in the same halls, following the same rhythms of academic life in pursuit of knowledge and truth. Nicholas Barton sits at his desk in the dim light of early morning, his quill scratching across a sheet of parchment as he attempts to parse a particularly challenging syllogism. The study of logic forms the foundation of the Oxford curriculum. In 1511, and Nicholas, now in his second year, spends countless hours grappling with its intricacies. Around him, the college slowly awakens, but Nicholas has been at his studies since before dawn, determined to master the material before the day's lecture. The text open before him is a well-worn copy of Aristotle's Prior Analytics, annotated heavily with Latin commentaries by medieval scholars who have interpreted and expanded upon the ancient philosopher's work. Nicholas reads slowly, mouthing the words as his finger traces the densely packed lines. Logic is not merely a subject at Oxford. It is the primary intellectual tool through which all other knowledge is acquired and tested. The framework upon which the entire edifice of university education rests. Students begin their studies with what is known as the trivium grammar, rhetoric, and logic before proceeding to the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. But it is logic that dominates the early years of study, providing students with the analytical tools they will need for more advanced learning, and for the formal disputations that constitute a central element of Oxford education. Nicholas pauses in his reading to dip his quill in the inkpot, carefully wiping excess ink on the rim to prevent blots and smudges that would mar his notes. His handwriting is small and precise, developed through years of practice and designed to conserve precious parchment and paper. The margins of his text are filled with his own observations, questions, and references to related works, personal dialogue with the material that reflects his growing understanding. The logic taught at Oxford follows the Aristotelian tradition as interpreted by medieval scholars, particularly Duns Scotus and William of Ockham. Students learn to identify and construct syllogisms, logical arguments consisting of a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. They study the different figures and moods of syllogisms, memorizing Latin mnemonic verses that help them differentiate between valid and invalid forms of argument. For example, Nicholas recites softly to himself, Barbara celerant deri ferio, Each of these peculiar words encodes the structure of a particular type of syllogism, with vowels indicating the types of propositions involved. Barbara represents a syllogism with 3 universal affirmative propositions, whilst indicates a syllogism with a universal negative major premise, a universal affirmative minor premise, and a universal negative conclusion. Beyond simple syllogisms, Nicholas studies more complex logical operations, conversion, opposition, and the reduction of one syllogistic form to another. He learns to identify fallacies, errors, in reasoning that may appear valid but violate logical principles. The study is abstract and demanding, requiring not only memorization but a deep understanding of how logical relationships function. At 8 o'clock, the college bell rings, signaling the approach of the morning logic lecture. Nicholas gathers his materials, a small notebook made of sewn pages, his precious copy of Aristotle's text, several sharpened quills, and his inkpot carefully stoppered to prevent spills, joining the stream of black-gowned students flowing toward the schools, the university buildings where lectures are held. He mentally reviews the material he expects to be covered today. The lecture hall fills quickly with students at various stages of their studies. They sit on long wooden benches arranged in tiers, creating an atmosphere reminiscent of a theater where knowledge rather than drama takes center stage. The room smells of parchment, ink, wool, and the particular mustiness that develops when many scholarly bodies occupy an enclosed space for hours at a time. At precisely the appointed hour, the regent master enters, his elaborate academic robes marking his status. Students rise respectfully, remaining standing until he gestures for them to be seated. Without preamble, the master begins his lecture in formal Latin, picking up precisely where the previous day's presentation had ended. Today's topic concerns the principle of contradiction, the logical rule stating that contradictory statements cannot both be true in the same sense at the same time. The master expounds on this fundamental concept, relating it to theological questions about divine omnipotence and the nature of truth. Nicholas listens intently, quill poised to capture key points and particularly elegant formulations. The lecture proceeds as a monologue, with students expected to absorb and record the master's words without interruption. Questions are not permitted during the formal presentation, but may be raised in subsequent sessions, specifically dedicated to disputation and discussion. Nicholas writes rapidly but carefully, occasionally inserting his own observations in the margins, using a system of symbols he has developed to distinguish between the master's statements and his personal reflections. For 2 hours, the lecture continues without break, the master's voice and the scratching of quills the only sounds in the room. When he finally concludes, students rise again as he departs, then gather their materials and file out, many already discussing points raised during the presentation or comparing notes to ensure they've captured essential concepts accurately. Nicholas has a brief interval before his next commitment to disputation practice with fellow students in preparation for the formal debates that will eventually determine his qualification for degrees. He uses this time to review his notes from the lecture, underlining key passages and adding cross-references to related material from previous sessions. The practice disputation takes place in a smaller room where Nicholas and 5 other students gather under the supervision of a bachelor who has recently completed his own studies in logic. One student is designated as the respondent, tasked with defending a particular thesis, while the others serve as opponents who attempt to refute his arguments using formal logical techniques. Today, Nicholas serves as an opponent, challenging the respondent's defense of the proposition all knowledge derives from sensory perception. Drawing on his studies of Aristotle and the commentaries of Thomas Aquinas, Nicholas constructs a syllogism to demonstrate that certain forms of knowledge, particularly mathematical and logical principles, cannot be derived purely from sensory experience. The exchange follows strict formal rules. Each participant must address the others in Latin using prescribed forms of address. Arguments must be presented in proper syllogistic form, with clear identification of major and minor premises. Violations of logical principles are immediately flagged by the supervising bachelor, who serves as both referee and instructor during the exercise. This practice session represents a crucial aspect of logical education at Oxford. While lectures provide the theoretical foundation, disputations require students to apply logical principles in real-time intellectual combat. Success in these debates depends not only on understanding logical structures, but also on quick thinking, rhetorical skill, and a comprehensive knowledge of authoritative texts that can be cited in support of arguments. After the disputation concludes, with the bachelor offering critiques and suggestions to all participants, Nicholas proceeds to the college library. Here, chained books line the walls, available for consultation, but secured to prevent theft of these valuable resources. Nicholas locates a copy of Boethius's De Syllogismo Categorico, seeking clarification on points raised during the morning's activities. The library is hushed, with students reading at long tables or standing before lecterns that hold larger volumes. Conversation is prohibited, and those needing to consult with others must do so outside or in whispers that won't disturb the concentrated silence. Light streams through high windows, supplemented by candles for those working in darker corners. Afternoon progresses toward evening. Nicholas continues his studies, moving from the library back to his chamber, where he reviews the day's notes and prepares materials for tomorrow's sessions. Logic is not merely a subject to be mastered and set aside. It is a continual practice, a mode of thinking that pervades all aspects of university education. In the quiet of his room, Nicholas returns to the syllogism that had challenged him at dawn. With the benefit of the day's lecture and disputation practice, he sees the structure more clearly now, understanding how the premises relate to the conclusion, and why the particular form follows the rules of valid inference. He makes a note of his insight, satisfied with the small but significant progress in his mastery of logical principles. As darkness falls and candles are lit throughout the college, Nicholas continues his work, part of a community of scholars engaged in the same intellectual pursuit. Logic may be abstract and demanding, but it provides the mental discipline and analytical tools that will serve him throughout his academic career and beyond, shaping not just what he knows, but how he thinks about the world and its mysteries. The evening bell eventually signals the approach of curfew, and Nicholas sets aside his studies for the day. Tomorrow will bring more lectures, more disputations, more hours bent over texts that have challenged generations of scholars before him. The study of logic at Oxford is rigorous and unrelenting, but it forms the essential foundation upon which all other learning builds, a systematic approach to knowledge that has defined Western intellectual tradition for centuries and continues to shape the minds of those who pass through this ancient institution. The rain taps gently against the leaded glass window of Edmund Fletcher's chamber as he stands before his small mirror, practicing the gestures that will accompany his upcoming oration. As a fourth-year student at Balliol College in the year, Edmund has advanced from the basic study of logic to the more refined art of rhetoric, the skill of persuasive and eloquent expression that forms a crucial component of the Oxford curriculum. His voice rising as he delivers a passage from Cicero's Pro Archaea, the Latin flowing mellifluously from his lips. The ancient Romans' defense of poetry and liberal studies seems particularly apt as Edmund prepares for his formal declamation before the college fellows, an exercise designed to demonstrate his mastery of rhetorical techniques and his readiness to progress to more advanced studies. Rhetoric at Oxford encompasses far more than mere oratory. It is the systematic study of effective communication in all its forms, drawing heavily on classical models while incorporating elements of medieval scholastic tradition. Students learn not only how to speak persuasively, but also how to structure written arguments, how to analyze texts for their rhetorical strategies, and how to adapt their expression to different audiences and purposes. Edmund consults his notes, carefully written on sheets of paper bound into a small volume. Unlike the study of logic, which relies heavily on abstract principles and formal structures, rhetorical education involves extensive examples and models. Students memorize notable speeches from classical antiquity, study the rhetorical treatises of Cicero and Quintilian, and practice composing their own orations, following established patterns and precepts. The classical division of rhetoric informs the Oxford curriculum. Students learn the 5 canons or components of rhetorical practice: inventio, invention, or discovery of arguments; dispositio, arrangement of material; elocutio, style and language; memoria, memorization; and pronunciatio, delivery. Each receives careful attention, with exercises designed to develop proficiency in all aspects of the rhetorical art. Edmund focuses particularly on his delivery today, knowing that his technical mastery of rhetorical principles will count for little if he cannot present his oration effectively. He practices modulating his voice, varying from the quiet intensity appropriate for reflective passages to the more forceful projection needed for key arguments. His gestures, far from random movements, follow conventions established by classical authorities: the open palm to indicate sincerity, the pointing finger for emphasis, the hand on heart for emotional appeal. At Oxford, rhetorical education integrates classical pagan models with Christian purposes. While students study Cicero and Quintilian extensively, they also examine the sermons of church fathers and medieval preachers who adapted classical techniques for religious instructions. Edmund's own declamation, though based on a classical model, will incorporate theological elements appropriate to his status as a scholar in a Christian institution. The college bell rings, signaling the hour for Edmund's rhetorical tutorial. He gathers his materials, notes, texts, and a small handbook of rhetorical figures compiled during his studies, and makes his way through the rain-slicked quadrangle toward his tutor's chambers. Other students hurry across the open space, gowns held above the puddles, heads bent against the persistent drizzle. His tutor, Master Thomas Lineker, is a distinguished humanist scholar who studied in Italy and brought back to Oxford the revived classical learning that characterizes the early Renaissance. Lineker's chambers reflect his scholarly interests, shelves lined with beautifully bound volumes of Greek and Latin texts, walls adorned with maps of the ancient world, and tables covered with manuscripts in various stages of annotation and translation. Edmund knocks respectfully and enters when bidden, finding his tutor seated at a large oak desk, examining a text through spectacles perched on his nose. Two other students are already present, seated on stools arranged before the desk. Edmund joins them, placing his materials on his lap and waiting for the session to begin. Master Lineker begins by asking each student to recite a passage assigned at their previous meeting selections from Quintilian's Institutio Oratoria. Concerning the arrangement of arguments, Edmund delivers his portion from memory, careful to pronounce the Latin correctly with appropriate emphasis and pacing. His fellow students follow in turn, each receiving brief comments or corrections from their tutor. The session then turns to an analysis of a sermon by St. Augustine, examining how the Christian bishop adapted classical rhetorical techniques for religious purposes. Master Lineker guides the students through the text, pointing out instances of anaphora repetition at the beginning of successive clauses, antithesis, juxtaposition of contrasting ideas, and other figures of speech that enhance the persuasive power of the sermon. Note how Augustine employs the periodic sentence structure here, Lineker observes, indicating a particularly complex passage. The main clause is delayed until all subordinate elements are presented, creating suspense and emphasis when the central idea finally appears. This technique, favored by Cicero, requires careful control of syntax and breath. The students make notes on this observation, Edmund adding it to his growing collection of rhetorical techniques that might be incorporated into his own compositions. The tutorial continues with discussion of the students' own rhetorical exercises submitted the previous week, brief, argumentative essays composed in Latin on assigned topics. Master Lineker offers specific critiques of Edmund's composition, praising his effective use of exempla, illustrative examples, while suggesting improvements to his transitional phrases. The feedback is detailed and sometimes pointed, reflecting the high standards expected of advanced students in rhetorical studies. The tutorial concludes with new assignments, passages to memorize, texts to analyze, and a rhetorical exercise to compose for the next meeting. Edmund carefully notes these requirements before gathering his materials and taking his leave, his mind already organizing approaches to the new tasks. Returning to his chamber, Edmund encounters his friend William Caxton, a fellow student of rhetoric, who will also be presenting a declamation in the coming week. They agree to practice their orations together that evening, each providing feedback on the other's performance. This kind of peer review supplements formal instruction, allowing students to refine their rhetorical skills through collaborative practice. After a brief meal in the college hall, Edmund and William meet in Edmund's chamber, pushing the simple furniture against the walls to create a space for their rhetorical performances. They take turns delivering their prepared orations, observing each other carefully for effectiveness of gesture, clarity of pronunciation, and overall persuasive impact. Your exordium is quite effective, William comments, after Edmund's practice, referring to the introductory section of the speech, but your gestures become repetitive during the narration. Remember Master Lineker's advice about varying your physical expression to match the content and emotion of different sections. Edmund acknowledges this criticism, making a note to diversify his gestural vocabulary, particularly during the narrative portion of his declamation. He offers similar constructive feedback on William's performance, suggesting adjustments to vocal pacing and emphasis that might enhance the effectiveness of key arguments. Their practice session extends into the evening, candlelight casting dramatic shadows as they move through their rhetorical performances. The study of rhetoric demands this kind of embodied practice, not merely intellectual understanding, but physical manifestation of persuasive principles through voice, gesture, and presence. As curfew approaches, they conclude their session, each having refined his oration through repetition and feedback. Edmund reviews his notes one final time before preparing for bed, mentally rehearsing sections that still require improvement. The following day brings Edmund to the college chapel, where weekly rhetorical declamations are held before an audience of fellows and students. This formal setting provides practical experience in public speaking while allowing college authorities to evaluate students' progress in their rhetorical studies. Edmund waits nervously as another student concludes his oration, a formal argument, supporting the study of Greek as essential to proper understanding of Christian texts. When his turn comes, Edmund approaches the lectern, arranges his notes, though he has memorized the entire declamation, and pauses briefly to gather his thoughts and calm his breathing, beginning with the traditional salutation to the assembled scholars. Edmund launches into his oration, a defense of rhetorical education as preparation for public service. His voice fills the chapel, modulated according to the principles he has studied so carefully. His gestures, deliberate and meaningful, enhance the persuasive force of his words. The Latin flows smoothly, his careful preparation evident in the fluid delivery of complex periodic sentences as he moves through the carefully structured sections of his oration. Exordium, introduction; narratio, background information; divisio, outline of arguments; confirmatio, presentation of evidence; refutatio, refutation of opposing views; and paratio, conclusion. Edmund feels the power of the rhetorical tradition he has inherited. These patterns, developed by ancient orators and refined through centuries of practice, provide a framework that channels his ideas and arguments into their most effective form. The fellows observe attentively, some nodding at particularly well-constructed passages or effective uses of rhetorical figures. When Edmund concludes his declamation with the traditional closing formula, the chapel remains silent for a moment before the senior fellow offers the customary words of acknowledgement and dismissal. Only later, when Master Lineker provides his evaluation, does Edmund learn how his performance was received. The criticism is constructive, but direct praise for his command of rhetorical structure and Latin expression. Suggestions for improving his refutation of counterarguments. Comments on the effectiveness of his delivery and presence. This cycle of instruction, practice, performance, and evaluation characterizes rhetorical education at Oxford. developing students' abilities through systematic attention to all aspects of persuasive communication. For Edmund and his fellow students, rhetoric is not merely an academic subject, but a practical art with applications in church, state, and civil society, wherever the ability to communicate effectively and persuasively serves individual and communal purposes. As Edmund returns to his studies that evening, reviewing Master Lineker's comments and planning improvements to his rhetorical technique, he reflects on the distance he has traveled from his first tentative exercises in eloquence. The art of rhetoric, demanding though it may be, has transformed not only his speech, but his thinking, teaching him to organize ideas logically, express them clearly, and present them persuasively. Rain continues to tap against his window as Edmund studies by candlelight, one more scholar in the long tradition of rhetorical education that stretches back to ancient Athens and Rome, now finding expression in the Gothic buildings and rain-soaked quadrangles of Tudor Oxford. The pre-dawn darkness envelops the college quadrangle as Thomas Middleton hurries toward the chapel, his breath forming small clouds in the cold February air of 1512. The bell tolls its familiar summons, calling students and fellows to morning prayers, the first of many religious obligations that will punctuate Thomas's day at Magdalen College. His gown billows slightly in the winter wind as he joins other black-clad figures converging on the chapel, their faces still marked with sleep, but their movements purposeful, aware of the consequences of tardiness for this mandatory observance. Religious life at Oxford is not separate from academic pursuits. It is thoroughly interwoven with them, creating a unified experience where worship, not optional but fundamental to university existence. With college statutes precisely prescribing devotional duties and penalties for neglect, the chapel doors stand open, light spilling out onto the cold stones of the quad. Inside, candles and oil lamps illuminate the space, their flames reflecting off polished wood and gleaming stone. Other students settle into position according to their rank and seniority, while at the front, college fellows arrange themselves in their designated stalls. As the final bell stroke fades, the chaplain processes in, accompanied by acolytes bearing candles and liturgical books. Morning prayers begin, conducted entirely in Latin, the universal language of Western Christian worship and scholarship. Thomas follows the familiar patterns of devotion, standing, kneeling, responding at appropriate moments with words embedded in memory through daily repetition. The service includes psalms chanted in plain song, their ancient melodies rising and falling in the vaulted space. Thomas joins the chant, his voice blending with those of his fellow students in harmonies that link this morning's worship to centuries of Christian devotion. Scripture readings follow, passages selected according to the church calendar, which structures not only worship but the entire academic year. Today's reading comes from the Gospel of Matthew, the chaplain's voice clear and measured as he relates Christ's teachings on faith and works. Thomas listens attentively, aware that religious knowledge is as integral to his education as logic, rhetoric, or natural philosophy. Religious texts form a significant portion of the Oxford curriculum, studied not merely for devotional purposes, but subjected to the same analytical scrutiny applied to secular works. Prayers for the king, the church, the university, and benefactors follow the scripture readings. Wainfleet, whose generosity centuries earlier made his education possible. Remembrance of benefactors constitutes an important element of college religious practice, a recognition of the continuity that links present students to those who came before. The service concludes with a blessing, and students file out in order of precedence, returning to their chambers to prepare for the day's lectures and studies. Thomas will return to this chapel multiple times throughout the day for Mass, in mid-morning for evening prayers as daylight fades, and occasionally for special services marking feast days or university occasions. Religious obligations extend beyond formal worship, permeating all aspects of college life. Meal times begin and end with Latin grace, spoken by designated fellows or scholars. Lectures open with invocations seeking divine guidance for the pursuit of knowledge. Even recreational activities observe religious boundaries, with certain games prohibited on Sundays and feast days, and all activities suspended during hours dedicated to worship. The academic calendar itself reflects religious priorities, organizing the year according to the Church's liturgical seasons. Terms are identified by their proximity to major religious festivals: Michaelmas, autumn; Hilary, winter; and Trinity, summer. Numerous feast days punctuate each term, many commemorated with special services, processions, or communal meals. Major breaks in the academic schedule coincide with the most significant religious observances, particularly Christmas and Easter. Fasting regulations further integrate religious practice into daily life. Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays are typically designated as abstinence days, when meat is prohibited. During Advent and the 40 days of Lent, dietary restrictions intensify, with additional limitations on animal products. College kitchens adjust their offerings accordingly. Thomas returns to college for the midday Mass, a central element of daily religious observance. This service, more elaborate than morning prayers, are required to attend and observe this central mystery of Christian worship. The college chapel gleams, finding his place once more among his fellow students. The Mass proceeds with greater ceremonial elaboration than the morning office. The chaplain, now vested in richer garments appropriate to this sacramental function. Incense rises in fragrant clouds, its symbolism drawing prayers heavenward, while physically sanctifying the space with its aromatic presence throughout the service. Host is elevated, bells ring, and all present bow in reverence. Though Thomas will not receive communion today, that privilege occurs on designated liturgical drama. Religious instruction forms a significant component of Thomas's academic program, with lectures dedicated to scripture, theology, and canon law. Even subjects that might seem secular, natural philosophy, mathematics, religious and secular knowledge, so clearly defined in later centuries. Like many students, he owns a small prayer book containing psalms, prayers, and devotional readings for private use. Spiritual advisors. Thomas visits the college chaplain monthly, as required by statute, to confess his sins and receive absolution. The content of these confessions varies: academic negligence, inappropriate language, failures of charity toward fellow students, or lapses in required religious observances. Penance assigned might include additional prayers. Oxford students participate in special religious observances. Throughout the academic year, Corpus Christi brings elaborate processions through the city, with colleges participating according to established precedents. All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day in November prompt special commemorations of deceased scholars and benefactors. The Christmas season, though falling during the break between terms for many students, beyond their primary spiritual function, students, fellows, and staff in common rituals. Vespers, the sunset prayer service that marks the transition from day to night. The chapel now glows with candlelight as daylight fades, creating an intimate atmosphere quite different from the bright clarity of morning worship or the formal solemnity of midday mass. The service is briefer than earlier observances, but no less essential to the rhythm of college life. Vespers concludes with the Magnificat, Mary's song of praise from the Gospel as Luke, its familiar Latin phrases echoing in the chapel as they have for centuries. Thomas joins in the chant. Thomas reflects briefly on the religious framework that structures his university experience. The multiple daily services, the theological studies, the moral guidance, the liturgical calendar, all these elements create a seamless integration of faith and learning that defines education at Oxford in the early 16th century. For Thomas and his fellow students, religious obligations are not adjuncts to their scholarly pursuits, but foundation, context, and purpose for them. Knowledge is understood as a path to greater comprehension of divine truth, with all subjects ultimately contributing to theological understanding. The religious practices that punctuate each day serve as reminders of this fundamental orientation. Turning the mind repeatedly toward contemplation of God and divine purposes, Thomas enters his chamber as the evening bell sounds across the college, marking curfew. He lights his candle from the corridor lamp, illuminating the small space where he will conclude his day as he began it in prayer. Tomorrow will bring the same cycle of devotions, integrated seamlessly with lectures, studies, meals, and all other aspects of Oxford life. In this era when education and religion remain inseparable components of a single coherent world-view, the school's quadrangle echoes with the sound of urgent footsteps as Henry Latimer makes his way toward the Divinity School, clutching a sheaf of notes in one hand while mentally rehearsing the arguments he has prepared for today's formal disputation. As a Bachelor of Arts working toward his master's degree at Corpus Christi College in 1507, Henry knows that his performance in this public academic exercise will significantly influence his scholarly reputation and future prospects at Oxford. Disputes form the core of advanced education at the university, serving simultaneously as teaching method, assessment tool, and public demonstration of intellectual prowess. Unlike modern examinations conducted in silence and isolation, these medieval academic contests take place before audiences of scholars and students, with success depending not only on knowledge, but on quick thinking, rhetorical skill, and the ability to deploy complex arguments in formal Latin while under pressure. Henry enters the Divinity School, one of Oxford's most impressive spaces, its elaborate, fan-vaulted ceiling creating an atmosphere that enhances the gravity of academic proceedings conducted beneath it. Senior doctors and professors occupy the most prominent positions. Graduate students and bachelors fill the middle sections, and undergraduate students observe from the rear. Addresses a theological question, whether divine foreknowledge necessitates human actions. Henry will serve as the respondent, defending the orthodox position that God's foreknowledge does not eliminate human free will. Against him, 3 designated opponents will raise objections and counter-arguments, attempting to undermine his position through logical analysis and citation of authoritative texts. The proceedings begin with formal announcements in Latin. Designated roles. Henry steps forward when called, moving to the respondent's chair positioned prominently before the assembled scholars. He bows respectfully to the presiding doctor. Contests decades earlier. The format follows established protocols that have governed Oxford disputations for centuries. First, Henry delivers his positio, a formal statement of his position on the question at hand, speaking entirely in Latin. Actions, yet this knowledge does not causally determine those actions. Divine foreknowledge and human freedom coexist without contradiction, though human understanding cannot fully comprehend this mystery. Henry's positio draws heavily on Thomas Aquinas's treatment of the subject in the Summa Theologica, supplemented by arguments from Augustine and Boethius. He structures his presentation systematically, first establishing key definitions and distinctions, then presenting positive arguments for his position, anticipating potential objections, and finally demonstrating how apparent contradictions can be resolved through proper understanding of the relationship between divine eternity and temporal human existence. Throughout this presentation, which lasts approximately 30 minutes, Henry maintains formal academic language and demeanor. His Latin is precise and fluent, employing the technical vocabulary of scholastic theology with confidence. His gestures remain minimal and dignified, appropriate to the serious intellectual context. At particularly effective arguments, others making notes for their own future reference. When Henry concludes his positio with the traditional formula, the first opponent rises from his seat. John Thornton, a fellow bachelor from Magdalen College, with a reputation for intellectual agility, begins his oppositio by formally acknowledging Henry's presentation before launching into his critique. The exchange follows the structure of scholastic dialectic, with John raising specific objections to elements of Henry's argument. You assert that divine foreknowledge does not causally determine human actions. It becomes impossible for me to perform action B instead. If doing otherwise than God foreknows is impossible, how can my choice be truly free? John develops this objection through formal syllogisms, citing Aristotle's definition of contingency and necessity, and arguing that foreknown actions must be necessary, rather than contingent. His Latin flows smoothly as he constructs his case, occasionally glancing at notes, but largely relying on memorized arguments and spontaneous responses to Henry's position. When John concludes, this requires quick thinking and thorough knowledge of the subject matter, as hesitation or confusion would damage his standing in the eyes of the observing scholars. Henry begins his responsio systematically, first clarifying the distinction between logical necessity and causal necessity, then explaining how divine foreknowledge creates the former but not the latter. When we say God knows I will perform action A, this knowledge does not cause my choice, but rather reflects what I will freely choose. The temporal sequence. The necessity arises not from causation, but from the fact of my future free choice, which God, being eternal, observes as if present. And Henry, defending his position, The interaction demands not only knowledge of theological and philosophical principles, but mastery of formal logic, as arguments must be presented in valid syllogistic form by the presiding doctor. After John concludes his opposition, the second appointed opponent rises. Margaret Wilson, known for her expertise in Aristotelian logic, approaches the question from a different angle, challenging Henry's reconciliation of divine omniscience with human freedom through a series of carefully constructed dilemmas. Like all participants, she speaks entirely in Latin, employing the technical vocabulary of scholastic disputation with practiced ease. If God's knowledge is infallible, Margaret argues, and if he knows I will sin tomorrow, then either I must sin, eliminating freedom, or God's knowledge is fallible, contradicting divine perfection. Your attempt to escape this dilemma through temporal distinctions fails to resolve the fundamental contradiction. Again, Henry must respond immediately, addressing the specific logical structure of Margaret's objection while maintaining consistency. With his earlier statements, the exchange grows increasingly technical. Relationship between knowledge and its objects. Observers follow closely, evaluating not only the content of arguments, but the formal validity of reasoning displayed by both participants. The third opponent, Thomas Gerard, from Balliol College, introduces scriptural elements to the debate, citing biblical passages that emphasize either divine sovereignty or human responsibility, and questioning whether Henry's position can adequately account for both scriptural emphases. This adds another dimension to the disputation. Presiding doctor occasionally interjects with clarifications or adjustments to the procedural format, ensuring that the disputation maintains its educational value and scholarly standards. Other doctors present may also contribute questions or comments at designated intervals, testing Henry's knowledge and responsiveness from different perspectives. The formal disputation concludes with Henry offering a summation of his position, incorporating responses to the main objections raised by his opponents. The presiding doctor then delivers an evaluation, commenting on the quality of arguments presented by all participants and offering his own resolution of the question under debate. Authoritative conclusion of the academic exercise. For Henry, this disputation represents more than an intellectual game. It constitutes a crucial element in his progress toward advanced degrees. Success in these formal debates demonstrates mastery of subject matter, logical reasoning, Latin eloquence, and the ability to engage with opposing viewpoints, essential qualities for scholars in the Tudor academic world. The evaluation he receives today will influence his academic standing and future opportunities within the university. After the formal proceedings conclude, participants and observers disperse. Many continuing discussions of points raised during the disputation. Henry receives congratulations from fellow students who appreciated particular aspects of his performance, along with a few good-natured challenges from those who remain unconvinced by specific arguments. This informal extension of the debate into college halls and private chambers forms an important part of Oxford's intellectual culture, with formal disputations serving as catalysts for ongoing scholarly conversation. Later that day, Henry meets with his tutor to review his performance, receiving specific feedback on both the content of his arguments and his disputation technique. While generally satisfied with how Henry defended the orthodox position, the Tutor suggests improvements to certain responses and recommends additional texts that might strengthen his understanding of divine foreknowledge for future debates on related topics. This pedagogical dimension reveals the multifaceted role of disputations in Oxford education. Beyond their evaluative function, these formal debates serve as teaching opportunities, allowing students to develop sophisticated understanding through the rigorous process of articulating and defending positions against informed opposition. The requirement to anticipate objections encourages thorough preparation, while the necessity of responding to unexpected arguments cultivates intellectual flexibility in his chamber that evening. Henry reflects on the day's experience, making notes about effective arguments and areas for improvement. Already, he anticipates future disputations. Both the regular practice sessions held within his college and the more formal university exercises required for his degree. Each will demand similar preparation, intellectual agility, and Latin fluency, gradually developing the scholarly capabilities expected of Oxford graduates. The medieval disputation tradition that Henry participates in has shaped Western intellectual culture for centuries, establishing patterns of argument and analysis that continue to influence academic discourse. At Oxford, in the early 16th century, these formal Latin debates remain at the heart of university education, linking contemporary scholars to generations of predecessors who developed their intellectual capabilities through the same demanding exercises in the same historic spaces as curfew approaches and Henry prepares for sleep. The words and arguments of the day's disputation still echo in his mind: Latin phrases, logical structures, theological distinctions, all part of the intellectual framework he is gradually mastering through the rigorous academic practices that define education at Tudor Oxford. The narrow cobbled streets of Oxford teemed with activity as Richard Thornton made his way cautiously from his college toward the market square on a crisp October morning in 1504. As a third-year student at Exeter College, Richard had learned to navigate both the physical geography of Oxford and the complex social terrain that separated university members from the townspeople who inhabited the same space. His black academic gown marked him unmistakably as a member of the university, a visual distinction that could either ease his path or create tensions, depending on the circumstances and the company he encountered. The relationship between town and gown, ordinary citizens and university members had been fraught with conflict throughout Oxford's history. The infamous St. Scholastica Day riot of 1355, when dozens of scholars and townspeople died in violent clashes that began with a tavern dispute over the quality of wine, remained part of local lore, commemorated annually by ceremonies acknowledging the town's formal submission to the university following that bloody episode. Though relations had improved somewhat in the intervening centuries, mutual suspicion and occasionally open hostility continued to characterize interactions between the two communities. Richard passed a group of apprentices unloading goods from a cart outside a merchant's shop. They glanced at his academic gown with expressions ranging from indifference to barely concealed resentment. He understood their attitude. University members enjoyed privileges and immunities that set them apart from ordinary citizens, creating economic and legal disparities that generated understandable friction. Chief among these privileges was the university's independent legal jurisdiction. Oxford scholars answered to university rather than town authorities for most offences, appearing before the Chancellor's Court rather than municipal magistrates. This separate legal system generally imposed milder punishments than townspeople might receive for similar infractions, a disparity not lost on local residents who viewed it as unfair protection for often rowdy scholars. Economic tensions further complicated town-gown relations. University regulations restricted trade within Oxford, giving college suppliers monopolies over certain goods and services, while limiting competition that might benefit ordinary citizens. Colleges owned substantial property throughout the town, functioning as major landlords whose interests sometimes conflicted with those of municipal authorities and local residents. Even taxation created discord, with university members claiming exemption from certain town levies while still benefiting from municipal services. As Richard approached the market square, the sounds and smells of commerce enveloped him. Vendors calling attention to their wares, the aroma of fresh bread and roasting meat, the clatter of wooden stalls being arranged for the day's business. Market days brought town and gown into particularly close contact, with students purchasing provisions to supplement college meals or seeking goods unavailable within university premises. Richard had a specific destination in mind: the stall of Thomas Cooper, a bookbinder known for quality work at reasonable prices. Though the university maintained tight control over book production and sales through its licensed stationers, craftsmen like Cooper operated at the margins of this system, binding previously purchased texts or repairing damaged volumes for both academics and those few townspeople wealthy enough to own books. "Good day to you, Master Cooper," Richard greeted the bookbinder, producing from his satchel a small volume with a damaged spine. "I wonder if you might repair this text for me. The binding has begun to separate from the gatherings." Cooper examined the book carefully, assessing the damage before naming his price. The interaction proceeded amicably, both men finding mutual benefit in the transaction, despite belonging to communities often at odds. This practical necessity of commerce frequently facilitated more positive town-gown relations than might otherwise exist, creating connections based on economic interdependence rather than institutional rivalry. After arranging to collect the repaired book the following week, Richard continued through the market, purchasing a small pouch of dried fruits to supplement his college diet. As he counted out coins to pay the fruit seller, a commotion erupted near. Raised voices, escalating quickly to shouted accusations between a group of students and several town youths of similar age. Richard could not discern the initial cause of the dispute but recognized the dangerous pattern unfolding. What began as a minor disagreement, perhaps an accidental collision in the crowded market, a perceived insult or disagreement over a transaction, rapidly transformed into a symbolic confrontation between town and gown, with individual participants becoming representatives of their respective communities. "Privileged scholars think they own the streets," one townsman shouted, his companions murmuring agreement. "Perhaps we should teach them Oxford belongs to all who live here." "The university was here before your grandsire was born," retorted a student, his academic Latin slipping into the vernacular as his temper rose. "Show some respect for your betters." This exchange, inflaming rather than resolving tensions, illustrated the historical grievances and social disparities that complicated town-gown relations. The university, with its ancient privileges and scholarly pretensions, appeared to many townspeople as an arrogant, exclusive institution imposed upon their community. Conversely, students and masters often viewed townsfolk as uncouth, uneducated, and resentful of learning they could not comprehend. Richard considered intervening, but hesitated, knowing that such conflicts could escalate unpredictably. Before the situation deteriorated further, the university proctors appeared officials responsible for maintaining discipline among students and protecting university interests in the town. Their arrival, accompanied by several Bedell's university officers who enforced Proctor's rulings, quickly dispersed the gathering crowd, with students reluctantly abandoning the confrontation rather than risking disciplinary action. This incident represented the formal system developed to manage town-gown tensions. Proctors patrolled Oxford streets regularly, especially areas frequented by students, ready to intervene in disputes and enforce university regulations beyond college walls. Their authority extended to restricted zones within the town, creating what amounted to university territory within the broader urban space. As Richard resumed his journey back, he passed one of Oxford's many taverns, establishments that exemplified the contradictory nature of town-gown relations. Taverns served as meeting points where the two communities intermingled, sharing spaces, if not always, goodwill. University regulations attempted to limit student access to these establishments, concerned about moral corruption, excessive drinking, and potential conflicts with townspeople. Nevertheless, scholars regularly frequented taverns, creating a social sphere where formal distinctions temporarily relaxed. Outside a tavern called the White Hart, Richard encountered his friend William Barton from Magdalen College, who urged him to join a group of students gathered inside. The wine is tolerable, the company congenial, and the hour still decent, William argued. Surely you can spare time before returning to your studies. Richard hesitated, aware that college authorities discouraged such gatherings, particularly during term time when students should focus on academic pursuits. Yet these informal social occasions formed an important part of university life, creating bonds between scholars from different colleges and occasionally even facilitating connections with local residents in more relaxed circumstances than formal town-gown interactions allowed inside the White Hart. The atmosphere was lively, but not yet rowdy, with groups of students discussing recent lectures, sharing college gossip, or engaging in philosophical debates fueled by moderate wine consumption. In one corner, a mixed group of scholars and townsmen played at dice, their game temporarily superseding social divisions that might otherwise separate them. Richard joined William and his companions, accepting a cup of wine while listening to animated discussion about a recent theological disputation at the schools. Their conversation remained academic despite the informal setting, reflecting how thoroughly intellectual pursuits permeated student life even during leisure hours. As afternoon progressed toward evening, the tavern grew more crowded, and Richard noticed increasing segregation between university and town patrons. What had been potential for positive interaction gradually transformed into subtle territorial marking, with students claiming certain tables while townsmen occupied others. Minimal interaction occurring between the separated groups. This pattern illustrated how even shared spaces often reinforced rather than diminished town-gown distinctions. The two communities might occupy the same physical environment while maintaining social distance, engaging in parallel rather than integrated activities. Occasional exceptions, scholarly townsmen joining academic discussion, a student conversing with local craftsmen about their trade, highlighted the rarity of genuine cross-community exchange. When the university curfew bell sounded across Oxford, Richard and his companions prepared to depart, knowing that proctors would soon begin checking for students remaining in taverns after permitted hours. This regulatory regime, enforcing university control over student behavior throughout the town, represented another source of tension with local authorities who resented external limitations on businesses within their jurisdiction. The walk back to Exeter College took Richard through darkening streets where the physical manifestations of university presence dominated the urban landscape. College walls rose imposingly, separating academic spaces from public thoroughfares. Churches served dual purposes as parish, places of worship, and settings for university ceremonies, their towers symbolizing the intertwined religious and educational functions that characterized medieval Oxford. As Richard approached his college gate, he encountered the night watch town guards responsible for maintaining order after dark. Their relationship with university authorities remained complex, with overlapping jurisdictions creating potential for conflict. Town watchmen could apprehend students violating curfew, but must deliver them to university officials for discipline, rather than town magistrates, a procedure that reinforced institutional separation even in matters of basic public order. The porter admitted Richard through the college gate just before it closed for the night, sealing scholars within their academic enclave until morning. This nightly ritual physically enacted the separation between university and town, with colleges becoming self-contained communities, isolated from the broader urban environment during evening hours. In his chamber, preparing for sleep after completing required academic reading, Richard reflected on the day's experiences navigating the complex territory where town and gown intersected. Despite centuries of coexistence, the two communities remained largely separate, linked by economic necessity and shared physical space, but divided by legal status, cultural differences, and historical grievances. Yet Richard, like many students, found himself occupying an intermediary position, formally part of the university, yet frequently engaging with town life through daily transactions, social activities, and practical necessities. This liminal experience, moving between academic and urban worlds, while fully belonging to neither, characterized the lived reality of Oxford students. Despite institutional boundaries that attempted to maintain clear separation as sleep approached, Richard considered how his education extended beyond formal academic instruction to include navigation of these complex social territories. Learning to interact appropriately with townspeople while maintaining his identity as a scholar represented an unacknowledged but essential component of his Oxford education, preparing him for future roles that would require similar negotiation between different social spheres. The troubled yet symbiotic relationship between town and gown would continue, evolving gradually as both university and city changed, yet maintaining fundamental tensions that defined Oxford as a place where two distinct communities shared a single space. their interactions characterized by both conflict and mutual dependence, separation and inevitable connection.